And we're live now at the Dirksen Senate Office Building, waiting for Acting White House Budget Director Russell Vought to testify before the Senate Budget Committee. They'll talk about President Trump's fiscal year 2020 budget request. Wyoming Senator Mike Enzi is the chair. We expect this to get underway momentarily. Live coverage now on C-SPAN 3.
Call to order the Senate Budget Committee hearing on the President's fiscal year 2020 budget request. And note that Senator Brown is here and Senator Grassley is here and Senator Kramer. Senator Perdue was here early studying. But I know that Senator Brown and Senator Grassley have to go to a meeting at the White House now, so they'll be back for questions later. So, good morning and welcome to the hearing on the President's budget request for fiscal year 2020. I want to thank Russell Vought, the Acting Director of the Office of Management and Budget, for being here to discuss the White House's budget request. While we would normally receive the budget submission in early February, the government shutdown delayed this process. I've been an outspoken advocate for reforming the federal budget process and will continue to seek improvements. But this afternoon, we'll focus on the President's plan for putting our country on a more sustainable fiscal path. The President's annual budget proposal is the first step in the federal budget process. This submission provides the administration an opportunity to cast a vision for the future and provide important programmatic information to Congress and the American people. I call it a list of pretty good suggestions, or at least suggestions. Budgets reflect spending and revenue priorities. Our hearing this morning will allow us to consider how the President's budget's priorities align with the priorities of Congress. In nearly every hearing held by this committee, I shine a spotlight on our country's fiscal challenges. It's no secret the federal government spends more than it takes in and will soon produce annual deficits exceeding $1 trillion. That's the equivalent of $1,000 billion, a figure that's too large to truly comprehend. Rising deficits add up to rising debt, and debt as a percentage of the economy is expected to surge in the coming years. According to the Congressional Budget Office, debt held by the public is expected to reach $16.6 trillion later this year, or 78% of the gross domestic product. By 2029, this debt is projected to grow to $27.8 trillion, or 93% of GDP. Considering the 50-year average is 42% of GDP, we're clearly headed in an ominous direction. This problem did not arise overnight. For decades, we've known of the budget pressures we face as the baby boom generation aged. Autopilot spending, that's mandatory spending, now represents more than 2/3 of what the federal government spends each year and grows with programs that aren't even reauthorized. And with more efforts, there are always more efforts to make more items mandatory. In my opinion, nothing should be mandatory unless it has its own source of revenue sufficient for the years. The growth in mandatory spending means that a smaller share of federal expenditures goes to so-called discretionary spending that's funded through the annual appropriations process and is made up of defense and non-defense programs that both sides of the aisle care about. Yes, 70% is mandatory and growing. Discretionary is borrowed money. We're in a credit card Congress. More and more, I've been hearing people claim that debt and deficits don't matter. This unconventional view is not only misguided, it's dangerous. Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, recently testified that the U.S. debt is growing at an unsustainable pace and that it would be a huge mistake to let that continue. Mr. Powell noted the idea that deficits don't matter is just wrong. That's a quote. Larry Summers, the Treasury Secretary under President Clinton and economic advisor under President Obama, noted that the theory behind the idea that deficits don't matter is being oversimplified and exaggerated by fringe economists who hold these ideas out as offering the proverbial free lunch. the ability of the government to spend more without imposing any burden on anyone. We also heard CBO disagree with this view in our last two hearings. Make no mistake, both sides share in the blame of the rising deficits and debt, and both sides must work together to address these issues. Just as these problems did not arise overnight, they're not likely to be solved overnight. That's why in the coming weeks, I'm hoping to put forward a budget resolution with a reasonable, achievable deficit reduction target as a first step in turning the tide of red ink. Ignoring the problem is not an option. I would ask that as colleagues review the President's budget and as we work together to craft a fiscal year 2020 budget resolution done by Congress, we are clear-headed about the challenges we face. Again, I thank our witness for being here, and I look forward to his testimony and to working with the administration and my colleagues to put our nation on a more sustainable path. Senator Sanders.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for holding this hearing. Mr. Vought, thank you very much for being with us today. Let me be as clear as I can be. This budget is an absolute disaster. It is an insult to the working families of this country, and I have to say, it really does expose Donald Trump for the fraud that he is. Over and over again, candidate Donald Trump, when he was looking for votes, promised the American people that he would be a different type of Republican. I think we all remember that rhetoric, that he would be a champion of the working class, that he would not cut Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security. I remember those speeches like it was yesterday. On May 7th, 2015, Mr. Trump tweeted, this is during the campaign, quote, "I was the first and only potential GOP candidate to state there will be no cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid," end of quote. August 10th, 2015, another tweet from Mr. Trump, quote, "I will save Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security without cuts. We have to do it. People have been paying in for years, and now many of these candidates want to cut it," end of quote. Donald Trump. That is what Mr. Trump said during the campaign, but now that he is president, the tune he is singing is very, very different. On page 32 of the briefing book of his budget, Donald Trump proposes cutting $1.5 trillion from Medicaid, $845 billion from Medicare, and $25 billion from Social Security. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to insert this page into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, let's just very briefly take a look at what these cuts do to the working families of this country at a time when millions and millions of families are struggling economically today. As I think most of us know, Medicaid pays for more than 2/3 of all of the nursing home care in our country, in addition, of course, to providing health care for millions of lower-income families. Question is, what happens to senior citizens in this country who are struggling with Alzheimer's and other serious illnesses who have their nursing home coverage paid for by Medicaid if that program is cut by $1.5 trillion? So you're a working-class family. Your mom is in a nursing home dealing with Alzheimer's, massive cuts to Medicaid. What happens to your mom? Or what happens to the ability of your family to take care of their basic needs now that you're going to have to pay an arm and a leg for nursing home care? But it's not just seniors. Today, Medicaid covers millions of children with special needs. We are the only major country on earth, embarrassingly, not to guarantee health care to all people as a right. But this budget makes a bad situation worse, and would throw millions of children with special needs off of the health insurance they have. We have an opioid epidemic from one end of this country to the other. But when you slash Medicaid by $1.5 trillion, you make it infinitely harder for communities and states to deal with this terrible crisis. But it's not just Medicaid. In terms of Medicare, the Federation of American Hospitals tells us, and I quote, this is not me, this is the Federation of American Hospitals, The new White House budget imposes arbitrary and blunt Medicare cuts to hospitals who will care for the nation's most vulnerable. The impact on care for seniors would be devastating, end of quote. During the campaign, President Trump told the American people that he was going to provide, and I quote, health insurance for everybody with much lower deductibles, end of quote. That's what he said during the campaign. Let's talk about what he is doing now that he is president. President Trump's budget would end the Affordable Care Act and throw an estimated 32 million people off the health insurance they have right now. Now, how in God's name can you talk about being a friend of working people and then propose to throw tens of millions of people off the health insurance they have? And at the same time, this budget would substantially raise premiums for older Americans and allow states to eliminate or substantially weaken protections for pre-existing conditions like cancer, diabetes, or asthma. This is a budget which will make it harder for our children to get a decent education, harder for working families to get the health care they need, harder to protect the air that we breathe and the water that we drink, and harder for the elderly to live out their retirement years with dignity and respect. This is not a budget, as candidate Donald Trump talked about, that takes on the political establishment. That was his rhetoric during the campaign. This is a budget of the political establishment, of the 1%, of corporate America, of the wealthiest people in this country. This is a budget which practices the Robin Hood principle in reverse. It takes from the poor and working families and gives to the very wealthy. As a candidate, Donald Trump said he understood the pain that working families across the country were feeling. This is not a budget that candidate Donald Trump talked about that takes on the political establishment. This is a budget that does very much the opposite. Mr. President, you do not help working families when your budget would eliminate financial aid to more than 1.5 million low-income college students. I mean, it is really quite incredible to me that people could prepare a budget when hundreds of thousands of kids in this country cannot afford to go to college, when millions of people are struggling with student debt, and this budget makes it harder for young people to go to college. Mr. President, and I would say also that it is unacceptable to me, coming from a cold weather state, and I see some of my other colleagues here coming from cold weather states that would eliminate the LIHEAP program. Seniors in Vermont stay warm because of LIHEAP. This program, this budget eliminates that. But I should say that at a time when we're now spending more on the military than the next 10 countries combined, this budget would expand military spending by $861 billion. Now, for the working families of this country, for the middle class, this is a disastrous budget, but I must confess, there are some good things in it for the wealthiest people in this country. After passing a nearly $2 trillion tax break that mainly benefited the top 1% and large profitable corporations a little over a year ago, the Trump budget would provide another $1 trillion tax break that would, you guessed it, primarily benefit the wealthiest people in this country. Think about it. Cuts to education, throwing millions of people off the health care that they have, cuts to programs that keep seniors warm in the wintertime. Again, more tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country. Mr. Chairman, last year, Amazon, Netflix, General Motors, and IBM, all very profitable corporations, not only paid nothing in federal income taxes, they actually received a tax refund from the IRS. They don't need another tax break when families in this country are struggling to keep their heads above water economically. Mr. President, this is a budget that should be discarded immediately, and a serious budget should be put together that protects working families and not just the 1%. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sanders, for your remarks. Our witness this afternoon is Acting OMB Director Russell Vought. Director Vought was confirmed to his position as OMB Deputy Director by the Senate in February of last year, and he oversaw the final development of the present fiscal year 2020 budget submission this year. We appreciate your work, and we look forward to receiving your testimony on the President's vision for the nation. For the information of colleagues, Director Vought will take up to 7 minutes for his opening statement, followed by questions. Welcome, Director Vought. Please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Enzi, Ranking Member Sanders, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on President Trump's fiscal year 2020 budget. On Monday, I submitted my full statement for the record. However, my oral testimony today, I just want to hit a few key points. Over the past 2 years, President Trump has unleashed the American economy through his pro-growth agenda, resulting in a return to prosperity for the American people. Working alongside many of you on this committee, President Trump signed historic tax reform into law, marking the first time in 30 years that our nation's tax code was updated and improved. It provided much-needed relief to all Americans, especially the middle class. Throughout his administration, President Trump has implemented a robust regulatory reform agenda, resulting in small businesses and the American economy saving more than $33 billion in burdensome regulatory costs. However, these great achievements will be challenging to maintain if we do not get our fiscal house in order. Annual deficits are continuing to rise and will exceed $1 trillion a year, and interest payments on the national debt are projected to double. Interest payments on the national debt are projected to exceed military spending by 2024. The national debt nearly doubled under the prior administration and is now more than $22 trillion. This level of debt is unsustainable and threatens the prosperity and economic freedom of future generations. The President's commitment to fiscal responsibility has been outlined in his previous budgets, and again today, he is requesting more reductions to both discretionary and mandatory spending than any other president in history. Yet each time this president has called for fiscal restraint and spending reform, he has been blatantly ignored. Instead, those opposing to decrease Washington spending have called for massive tax increases as a means to reduce the deficit. However, not only would this punish taxpayers, destroy jobs, and slow America's economic engine, but it also would ignore the reality of our current fiscal situation. Contrary to fearful predictions before the passage of tax reform, revenues are increasing and are in line with 50-year historic averages. The problem is not that Americans are taxed too little, it is that Washington spends too much. This budget is yet another fiscally responsible and common-sense spending plan from President Trump. I look forward to working with members of this committee and Congress and remain hopeful that we can prove to the American people that our government is capable of passing budgets and balancing the budget by prioritizing efficient and effective spending. Thank you for your time. I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you. Now we'll turn to questions. Let me take a moment to explain the process for all the committee members before we start. Each member will have 5 minutes for questions, beginning with myself and then somebody. Following that, we'll alternate questions between the Republicans and the minority. All members who were in attendance when the hearing started will be recognized in order of seniority. For those who arrived after the hearing began, you're on a list in order of arrival. If it's your turn on the list to be recognized but you're not available, we'll move on to the bottom of the list and turn to the next senator on the list to ask questions. With that, I have a few questions. Director Vought, the President's budget requests a large increase in overseas contingency operations funding to provide a total of $750 billion in defense spending in fiscal year 2020. Can you walk us through the thought process on this approach and what seems to change in the administration's position on use of the overseas contingency operation designation to the fund-based requirements?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. We, as you mentioned, do propose $165 billion into the OCO account. This is the money that we believe is necessary to continue the rebuild of the military in excess of what the current cap level for defense of $576 billion would be. to arrive at a number of $750 billion. When you also factor in $9 billion in military construction funding. Our view is that we need to move away from the types of two-year caps deals that are largely unpaid for, in which we increase spending for non-defense discretionary spending, and the current paradigm is to have $1 of non-defense spending increase for every $1 of defense spending increase. We believe that paradigm needs to go in a different direction. We believe that it's important that we actually make choices. We're now in a time of $22 trillion in national debt, trillion-dollar deficits. We need to be able to say to the American people, we can afford to continue to spend money on the military and rebuild it to what the Commander-in-Chief believes is necessary to secure the country, and we're going to identify dollars that to non-defense spending programs that we can no longer afford. We have gone through a process to identify programs that we believe can receive less money and still perform the functions that they were either set up or can be reformed. But it is vital from our standpoint that we move away from these two-year caps deals that really don't allow us to set choices. And I just would make one last point. I know you have other questions. As it pertains to the mandatory reforms that people often talk about that are attached to these two-year deals, we've seen less and less mandatory reforms with each of these cap agreements since 2011. And when you look at the fine print, they're often not mandatory reforms that will lead to fundamental change of our fiscal situation. They're often extending user fees or extending laws that are currently set to expire, but they rarely have the types of reforms that actually lead to the lowering of the cost curves that we talk about as it pertains to mandatory spending.
Thank you. The President's budget proposal supports currently authorized level of spending for the Highway Trust Fund through fiscal year 2020. When Fixing America's surface transportation, the FAST Act expires, OMB's baseline appears to reduce Highway Trust Fund spending to match revenue levels beginning in 2021. Is this a realistic assumption on the future spending for the Highway Trust Fund? Does the administration support any policy options maintaining transportation spending as FAST Act levels after its expiration?
Well, let me first start by saying what a priority infrastructure spending is for this president. It's one of the reasons why we include a $200 billion investment into infrastructure that's not meant to just be surface transportation, and that's one of the reasons why it is considered outside of the trust fund. So this president's very committed to that. In terms of the questions that you asked, we reflect current law with this, and so we think it's a more accurate baseline. That said, we do recognize that there's about $150 billion shortfall in the trust fund that needs to be addressed, and we are willing to work with Congress along those same lines. Another point I would like to make on infrastructure is we do have less detail on our infrastructure plan this year as it pertains to the first two budgets. That's intentional. It's because we recognize that Congress had concerns with our first two proposals, and we want to pass a law, or we want to enact a law that you all are able to send us. And so we're trying to work with you all, and we're in wait and see to be able to identify ways that we can work with you all to be able to put a bill on the president's desk.
Thank you. And my time's almost expired, so I'll move on to Senator Stabenow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Vought. First of all, we have a maternal and infant health crisis in this country. Mr. Vought, can you explain to me why the administration eliminates funding for more than half of the maternal and child health programs at the Health Resources and Services Administration?
We believe that we put forward a top line at Health and Human Services that will be able to fund the programs that we think work, that we can, with a good faith effort, say are putting resources where they can do the most good.
Okay, let me start just in the interest of time. So we have 7 programs zeroed out. Could you name those?
I don't know which programs you're specifically referring to, but I'd be happy to comment.
Sickle cell demonstration program, autism and other developmental disorders, heritable disorders, universal newborn hearing screening, emergency medical services for children, pediatric mental health care access grants, screenings and treatment for maternal depression. This category, 7 programs, has a subtotal of $144 million. And I'm wondering, do you know where the U.S. stands in infant mortality rates among the top 35 wealthiest countries?
I don't have that fact in front of me.
32. 32. Only Mexico, Turkey, and Chile are worse than the United States of America. And you're proposing to cut more than half of the maternal and child health programs when we have a crisis for moms and babies. We're also one of only 13 countries in the world where the rate of maternal mortality is worse than it was 25 years ago. Is that acceptable?
One of the things that we find unacceptable, Senator, is the fact that with a $1 trillion deficit and $22 trillion in debt, that when it comes to identifying programs that we believe we can look and move away from.
You're not seriously saying that money is more important than the lives of babies and moms? Is that what I'm telling you? That's what you're telling me, that screening, treatment for maternal care, pediatric mental health care, autism, so that these things are less important in your eyes than, frankly, the Republican tax cut that passed last year that really created the deficit.
I'm saying that when we look at budgets and when we try to identify which programs work and we eliminate programs, it's done because we don't think that they're effective.
So you believe these programs are not effective. I would like a follow-up from you, an analysis on each of these 7 programs and what is not effective. Let me go on, because it's even worse when you look at the president's Medicaid cuts. $1.5 trillion, $1.5 trillion, that's a lot of zeros. And I'm wondering if you're aware that Medicaid covers nearly half of all the births in our country.
I am aware of that.
Okay. These cuts would be catastrophic, and to top it off, the budget doubles down on harmful policies to expand junk insurance plans and take away coverage for pre-existing conditions by eliminating the Affordable Care Act. And I just want to note that prior to the Affordable Care Act, 3 out of 4 health plans in the non-group insurance plan didn't cover delivery and inpatient maternity care. I fought very hard and got that included as a member of the Finance Committee. And so now it is covered until recently with the new junk plans where none of them cover maternity care. So talk about a double whammy on moms and babies, moms and babies, at a time when we are 32nd among the wealthiest countries in the world, and we have this outrageous budget in front of us. So the administration may claim to care about women and children's health. There's no way, obviously, that that is true. So let me just say also that with the time left, Mr. Chairman, I'm not even sure where to go with Medicare cuts, Medicaid cuts, what you're doing to our Great Lakes, which is 90% of the country's fresh water, eliminating 90% of the support for that. When I look at agriculture, when we just passed a farm bill with the largest bipartisan vote in the history of the country, it was a great bipartisan effort, and your budget cuts 31% of the agriculture programs, the rural development for small towns and food programs, in addition to 15% of the USDA budget to implement programs. I don't even know where to begin with all of this. I would suggest that we throw it out the window, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Would you like a chance to respond?
Yeah, just briefly, I just want to say that we do not cut Medicaid in this budget. We do not cut Medicare in this budget.
Please. Please, I mean,
I'm happy to walk you through the numbers, Senator.
You're happy to walk.
There is I know that you think there's 1.4.
$1
trillion in Medicaid reductions. We then provide money in the form of state health block grants as consistent with the Graham-Cassidy approach to repealing and replacing Medicare.
Right.
That leads to only 271 savings in Medicaid and the state health care block grant. Those two line items will continue to increase each and every year, and as a result, we're not cutting Medicaid or those programs. We think that we're actually reforming it to be able to address the populations that Medicaid was founded.
You are putting block grants in place that
Senator
are not
Perdue.
required to even be used on health
Thank you,
care.
Mr.
So we
Chairman.
have a bigger debate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Perdue.
You know, I find this really interesting. You know, in 2000, let's just talk about the realities here instead of the emotion. In 2000, this government had $6 trillion of debt. At the end of President Bush's 8 years, we had $10 trillion of debt. At the end of 16, we know what doesn't work because we had 8 years of the lowest economic output in U.S. history. We added more debt as a government than all prior presidents before. We doubled the debt in 8 years. And now we want to hide behind that the tax bill that made our corporations more competitive with the rest of the world, created 5 million jobs over the last 2 years, eliminated this outrageous, and the only country in the world that still had a repatriation tax to free up some $2 or $3 trillion to get back and invest in American manufacturing again. And the CBO said if you grew the economy less than 0.5%, I think it was 0.4%, it more than paid for it. Well, we're doing more than that. It's growing over 3.1% the latest quarter. If you look at the last year, we've got the highest median income in U.S. history, lowest unemployment in about 50 years. There's no question we know what didn't work for 8 years and what's beginning to work now. Here's the problem. Right now we have a $1.1 trillion deficit. That did not start this year or last year. The problem is we spend discretionary is $1.4 trillion, if I understand this right, in 2020. Mandatory is about 2.8, and here comes the punchline. Because of the $22 trillion of debt, interest goes up over $100 billion just in 2 short years. By 2023 or 24, you're saying we'll spend more on interest than we do on the military at current interest rates. The problem is right now we subsidize, this is the crisis that we're facing here, and nobody wants to talk about it. We're losing the right to do the right thing. Everybody wants to do everything that everybody wants to do. The problem is, and I have a question coming here real quick, but I want to set this ground. Social Security right now is bankrupt. That trust fund was never supposed to go to zero. It goes to zero in 12 years by CBO's estimate, not my estimate. Medicare goes to zero in 8 short years. These things have to be saved. Medicare right now, Medicaid, we're paying that out right now at the level of $400 billion a year. So right now we've got a $1 trillion issue right there that can be solved. Both sides have solutions on it. I think there are compromises that can be do that. My question here is, given the reality that discretionary spending is lower now than it was in 2009, and it's actually where it was back in the 60s, and that discretionary spending as a percentage of GDP has been declining for the last 50 years, except for a few blips. We know the problem over the next 20 years is all in mandatory. Is this budget that we're looking at a first step toward a long-term plan of dealing with something that neither side has wanted to deal with here for the last 20 years? And that's the explosive crisis in the fact that Social Security and Medicare those trust funds are going to go to zero. At that point, I'd like to see people on both sides of the aisle talk about how they're going to explain to their constituents they can't pay out the benefits that we've been promising them for the last 100 years. Would you address the long-term implications of how this budget addresses that long-term issue?
As it pertains to mandatory spending, which is the spending that's on autopilot each year, this budget proposes more mandatory spending savings reductions than any president's budget in history, other than the first 2 presidents' budgets of this administration. So we believe that for those, including this administration, that recognizes the problems with the escalating cost on the mandatory side, we believe this budget is a very good faith effort, quite frankly, a historic effort to address those concerns. Our Medicare reforms push out the trust fund expiration date by 8 years. Again, there's no...
Can you say that again?
Our Medicare reforms in here that provide savings to lower seniors' drug pricing costs and attempts to make other program integrity reforms. They push out the expiration date of the Medicare Trust Fund by 8 years.
That means the trust fund, well, you've extended by 8 years the crisis that I just mentioned.
Correct.
To your knowledge, did any budget presented by President Obama attempt to do that?
I don't recall what his expiration dates were. He did include many of the same mandatory reforms as it pertains to Medicare that is causing concern on this side of the aisle.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vought, I will tell you, when I look at your budget, it offers up almost an inexhaustible supply of bad ideas for working families, for seniors, for the vulnerable. And as the ranking Democrat on the Tax Writing Finance Committee, I know that many of these ideas are paid for, certainly in part, through borrowed dollars that were generated by a tax bill stacked in favor of the 1%. And just so we're clear on this point, Mr. Vought, if I can see you, Graham Cassidy, which you touted, tanked in the Senate Finance Committee because Republicans saw that it hurt so many vulnerable people, they couldn't even bring it up. So you are recycling a proposal that was already exposed as a mess for the vulnerable, as evidenced by the fact that Republicans in the Senate Finance Committee, where I and Senator Whitehouse, in fact, Senator Enzi, we all served, Republicans couldn't even bring it up. Here's my question. One of your particularly ill-advised ideas, as it affects my part of the world, is to once again try to sell off the Bonneville Power Administration. Now, this is a plan that basically steals from Oregonians, from our businesses, from our families. It was unacceptable when George Bush tried to do it. It has been unacceptable year after year after year, and yet you still seem to be hunting and pecking for a way to advance this idea that would be so harmful to the American people. And the people it's going to hurt are the folks who are on an economic tightrope. They balance their food against their fuel, and their fuel against their medical care. And could you just explain to me, because I'm going to have town hall meetings Friday. I'm going to basically be flying most of the night to get home to small communities in rural Oregon where Bonneville Power is enormously important. Can you tell me how the administration's proposal to sell off Bonneville Power will be in the best interests of families in rural Oregon, where I'm going to be in less than 48 hours?
Sure. As you noted, we do propose to sell the transmission lines and many of the electrical assets of the Bonneville Power Administration. Most of the electricity generation transmission lines across this country are owned currently by the private sector. We believe that that can work in this situation as well, and that from the standpoint of federal taxpayers, including the people of Oregon, that they can benefit from $5.7 billion that is reducing the deficit and allowing us to save some money so that we don't have to make reductions elsewhere. So from the standpoint of your constituents, we don't think that there's going to be adverse impact, and we want to move away from the fact that when the private sector is not in charge of being able to make capital investments without the federal government being backing behind that, it's not the most efficient allocation of resources, and that's what we're trying to move away from in this budget.
Well, you finally exposed the heart of this ideological agenda. We haven't actually had somebody do that as far as I can remember. You used the word privatize. What your agenda now, and I'll make sure that folks in rural Oregon know about that this weekend, your agenda is to privatize Bonneville. I haven't even heard other conservatives say that. They've talked about market-oriented reforms, but you said you wanted to privatize it. I'll tell you, this is a loser. It is a loser for the families I represent. Senator Murray, my seatmate from Washington State, very much shares the view. And I'll just wrap up by giving you extra points for candor, because you're going somewhere where the far right hasn't really gone, and that is to, in effect, say you are for thorough privatization of Bonneville Power. And I guarantee you that's going to hurt a lot of people in our part of the world, and I hope you'll rethink it. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Senator Scott.
First off, Mr. Vought, thank you for your hard work. I walked in eight years ago as governor with a $4 billion budget deficit, and prior administration that had raised taxes, increased debt, and it made it very difficult. We lost jobs, all those things. And so I know it's very difficult to allocate the dollars and try to get a return on all the dollars that government spends. And so I went through a lot of this. So, and ours was smaller. I think we had about 4,000 lines to our budget. And we're trying to get a return. One of the things that is important to me in your budget that surprised me, though, was the dike at Lake Okeechobee, the federal project. It's I had to put up state money, even though it was a federal project, to try to push along to get it done. It's causing algae blooms when the water's discharged to the Caloosahatchee or the Indian River Lagoon. And we worked with Congress and President Trump to get the funding last year to finish the dike by 2022. What we've been spending minimum is over $200 million on Everglades restoration. And in Senator Rubio and others and I had requested $200 million this year. The federal government, going back 25 or 30 years ago, committed to be a partner with us in Everglades restoration. They've not been. They're about $2 billion behind us. But in this one, rather than $200 million, you did the South Florida economic restoration at $63 million. Can you just explain why and the thought process, and if there's an opportunity to, if you guys have looked at it since then, and your position is going to change?
Well, thank you for the question, Senator. As it pertains to the Army Corps and the Everglades restoration, it's certainly a priority of this administration. If you look at our budget, the amount that we provide for that important work is the most that we provide for any ecosystem project in the country. We think it reflects well on what we think about that project. We're also cognizant that Florida has received $1.6 billion when you add up all the disaster money that's in the circulation as well. We set a top line for Army Corps that caused us to make trade-offs. We have some overall concerns with the pace of work at Army Corps, and we want to be able to ensure that they work on the stuff that's already in the projects that are already in the pipeline. But we are certainly willing to work with you on an ongoing basis, and we do recognize that Congress provided more money than we would have liked in the Army Corps budget during the appropriations process, and as a result, last year the Everglades project went higher than what we proposed in the budget and ended up at $100 million. So we'll certainly work with you if Congress appropriates more than our budget in working through that important work. And I know that you've had many conversations with the President about the important work of restoring the Everglades, and you know that we've stood by the commitments we've made with regard to those projects.
And the dike money that was appropriated last year, there's no interest in trying to redirect any of that. Is that right?
I'm not aware of that idea, but I'm happy to work with you and talk about it further.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's significant because if we have any significant rainfall, we end up the Corps is set in their position. They have to discharge water to make sure they don't have a break in the dike. And so I just want to make sure, put a lot of effort in 8 years to try to get the money and get that the dike funded, and I don't want it to change. I'm still disappointed that there's not more money for Everglades restoration. So.
Understood.
But thanks for your hard work, and I know having to do something similar for 8 years, it's very difficult to allocate the dollars.
Thank you.
Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witness. The claim that the president's interested in fiscal responsibility is sort of undercut by the fact that this budget doesn't reach balance till year 15. We've been in a track record here where presidents of both parties have been submitting budgets that try to hit balance within 10 years, whether or not we get there or not. So the president saying, well, we'll hit balance within year 15 completely undercuts the pretense to fiscal responsibility. I want to ask you about funding on education. Page 135 in the budget blueprint suggests that the congressional appropriation in fiscal year 2019 was $70.5 billion in the education accounts, and in 2020 the president's request is $62 billion, a reduction of $8.5 billion, a 12% cut. Are we just spending too much money on education?
We believe that it's important to identify programs that work and programs that don't work.
Which don't work?
Well, for instance, we look at the 21st Century Community Center program. It's about $1.5 billion program. We look at the evidence and we find that students only stay for about 30 days in the program, and they don't. The majority of them don't improve at all in reading or math.
So you propose to eliminate that?
We do.
And what other programs do you think we shouldn't spend money on?
We propose to eliminate large block grants as it pertains to teacher development, because the amount of money is so diffuse that it does not lead to results. We propose to eliminate the Title IV block grant because, again, it ends up being a transfer to schools and localities in which the dollars ends up being $30,000 per school district, and it doesn't lead to achievable results for students. But that said, our vision of education spending, Senator, also is reflected in the fact that we have $50 billion.
Yeah, let me come to that. I'm going to ask about that now. I think it's interesting. The overall cut to education is $8.5 billion. It's a 12% cut. Some of the programs you mentioned, you don't think they're valuable. Your secretary, who's not a champion of public education, doesn't think they're valuable, but public educators actually do think they're valuable. But you do something very interesting. You have a education freedom scholarship. So you're cutting $8.5 billion a year out of public education money, and you're promoting $5 billion a year as a tax credit for individuals or corporations that want to give money for private school vouchers. I'm going to talk about that one for a minute, a tax credit. And I believe it's a dollar for dollar tax credit. Right now, if I want to write a charitable contribution to one of the schools, a good private school, so they can help kids afford to go there, I get a tax deduction. I have to be generous, but then I get a benefit from the tax code by being generous. Not a dollar for dollar benefit, but a benefit. And I get that benefit if I write a contribution to a public school, to my Jesuit Catholic high school, to a private school that would be interested in vouchers. We have an across-the-board policy. As long as it is an educational institution that's a 501c3, if I contribute, I do have to put a little skin in the game. I have to show that I'm generous, but then the federal government will give me a tax deduction. I'm not aware of other big programs of this kind where you don't get the tax deduction, but you get a dollar for dollar tax credit. If you get a tax credit, it means I don't have to be generous at all. I contribute a dollar, and then I get to reduce my tax liability for a dollar, so I don't have to be generous at all. You've completely removed generosity from the equation. And I think it's interesting that the proposal would suggest that we would prefer contributions to private school voucher programs and put those in a preferred place to any other educational contribution. Given to my local K-12 school doesn't get a tax credit. Given to a public or private college or community college doesn't get a tax credit. Giving to a parish, a parochial school, doesn't get a tax credit. You only get a tax credit if you're supporting vouchers. What evidence, since you're interested in evidence, what evidence makes you conclude that private school vouchers should be educationally preferred from a tax standpoint over any other form of education that's offered in this country?
Well, first of all, the tax credits would be able to be used for public school choice and private school choice. They would be designed at the state level. They would be able to not just go to private schools. That said, we think that parents and families have a say in which are the effective schools in their communities. We think that they vote with their feet, or we would like them to be able to vote with their feet and be able to have the resources that are necessary to have scholarships available and to be able to make those decisions for themselves. That's a vision difference that we believe is reflected in this budget, in that we want parents and families and local communities to have more of a say in how their children are educated than the federal government doing that.
I think that is a significant philosophical difference, to elevate one form of education with a tax credit that eliminates the need to be generous. If you get a tax credit dollar for dollar, you don't have to put any skin in the game. And to say that private schools that offer voucher programs are such that they should be preferred in that way when you don't get that tax credit for contributing to your local public school or your university strikes me as exactly the wrong way to go. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. Vought. I assume in your job, Mr. Vought, you receive a salary?
I do.
Okay. And your family has a fixed amount of income every year?
We do.
Okay. How long would your family last financially if every month you just charged more and more to your credit cards and paid the minimum?
We would face ruin financially, because at some point people would start to collect on what we would owe them. Yeah. And we would not be able to pay those bills, and they would come asking for our house.
Well, I mean, at some point, the amount of interest that you would be paying on the credit card would take up most of your disposable income, would it not?
It would.
Yeah. The federal government's kind of in that shape right now, aren't we?
We are.
Yeah, I saw a statistic the other day that we borrow $1 million a minute, $1.4 billion a day. Since we've been talking, we just borrowed $2 million to run this place. I want to thank you for trying to save taxpayer money. We have a legislative auditor in Louisiana who goes in and does an audit of all of the state programs. Our auditor did an audit of our Medicaid program. I'll read you the incomes of some of the people on Medicaid in Louisiana that he found. Recipient number 1 on Medicaid makes $155,840. Recipient number 3 makes $311,069. Here's an oldie but a goodie. Recipient 13 makes $390,968. Recipient number 8 makes $124,227. You know what happened to those people? Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. And you're a mean old man for trying to save taxpayer money. Do you believe that there is a single, solitary, fair-minded person in America who didn't just parachute in from another planet, who doesn't believe there is waste in the federal budget?
I have yet to meet one of the average day Americans.
And it's their money. I mean, you can laugh if you want, but it's inappropriate. I want to ask you about an article I read. Are you familiar with the expression use it or lose it spending?
I am.
What's that mean?
It's some would say a practice in which if you are at the end of the fiscal year and your spending is going to lapse, there's an incentive to spend that money so that you don't have it sitting as an unobligated balance that would then cause us, when we write budgets, to say you don't need additional money the next year.
Are you aware that at the end of last fiscal year, the Department of Defense at the last minute spent $4.6 million on lobster tail and crab?
I am aware of that report, and we're looking into it.
Somebody else bought a Wexford, leather club chair for $9,241. Another agency spent $53,004 on China tableware. $673,471 on golf carts. I mean, that's a disgrace. I mean, that's just a disgrace. Do you know how much Americans spend of their hard-earned money in America every year trying to help people less fortunate than they are?
Pardon, what's your question, sir?
Do you know how much, sorry, I'm not being clear. Do you know how much Americans spend of their hard-earned money every year, tax dollars, to help people less fortunate than they are?
They are very generous. I don't have the specific figure.
Try $1 trillion. That's 12 zeros. So I just think people are mistaken when they suggest that if you're trying to save money, that somehow makes you a cold, heartless person. And I wanted to thank you for your efforts to try to help us save taxpayer dollars.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Whitehouse.
I guess it would kind of depend on what money you're trying to save before you could make that moral judgment. If you're trying to prevent a family from getting health insurance and at the same time trying to make sure that a big corporation doesn't pay any taxes at all, then I come down a little bit on the other side of Senator Kennedy, as much as I appreciate and share the concern about lobster tails and fancy china and golf carts. But I don't think we're here about lobster tails and fancy china and golf carts. Do you anticipate, Mr. Vought, any knock-on economic effects from cutting 31% of the Army Corps budget, either generally or in the localities where projects would be ended or not funded?
We have not done an assessment specifically as it pertains to the Army Corps. That said, we
How
do
about
think
highways?
that infrastructure.
You proposed 22% cut to the highway discretionary budget. Have you done any estimates of what knock-on economic effect that would either have nationally or in the localities where major projects would be delayed, closed, or unfunded?
We believe that our economic growth numbers, which project 3% growth in the years ahead, they do reflect the administration's policies, including infrastructure investment. So when we talk about a $200 billion investment.
Yeah, I get that. That's like you're saying we put it all in there and we spit out this number at the end. What I'm asking you is there a number attributable to the 31% cut in Army Corps spending or the 22% cut in highway spending that you propose?
Again, I think the last figure that you talked about with regard to the year over year with the Department of Transportation needs some context. We had
I'm just asking a really simple question. Have you done any analysis to show what the knock-on economic effects are of cuts of that magnitude in those construction and infrastructure programs? And I don't know why that's such a difficult question to answer. Could you please give it another try?
From a line item perspective, we've not done a specific analysis as it pertains to the various reductions that you were referring to. That said, right, in totality of this budget and the infrastructure spendings that it calls for, we do think that we're investing in infrastructure, and we do think it'll lead to economic growth.
I would love to have you and candidate Trump debate this infrastructure number, because I think candidate Trump would tear you to pieces over your infrastructure investment, considering the promises that he made on the campaign. This was one of many that have evaporated since then. Let me ask you about something else. Let me ask you about climate change. What do you anticipate the effects are of climate change with respect to Department of Defense bases, particularly bases located near sea level rise, coastal bases, Norfolk Naval Station and others like that I mentioned with Senator Kaine here, and operating costs?
We don't have any assumptions along those lines.
What do you propose in your budget regarding climate change with respect to domestic ports and infrastructure and needs through the Army Corps or other infrastructure development, protecting our coastal ports and infrastructure?
We've analyzed our investments in ports along the seaboard as something that's based on the need in those areas. We have not done it on the basis of climate change.
How about the federal flood insurance program? Have you baked in any estimates to your flood insurance program liability numbers that relate to climate change and sea level rise?
We have not.
And with respect to FEMA disaster dollars, have you baked into your, I know that's a little bit, it tends to come in off budget because it comes in as emergency spending. I don't know if you've incorporated that in your numbers. Let me ask you that question first.
We have not.
So it's not in there at all? Emergency spending is not in there at all?
No, there is emergency spending for, that's reflected in this budget. We continue to make the request
even though
of
it's
what's necessary.
So-called off-budget here in Congress, you have emergency spending in the president's proposed budget?
We do. From a standpoint
and
of
it incorporates nothing with respect to sea level rise and climate change?
Correct. Our emergency spending from our perspective is
up.
not off budget.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Vought. Wasteful spending would be a bad thing regardless of what federal agency it was in, right?
Yes.
Okay. And isn't it true that the Defense Department has been the major federal department that for years couldn't pass an audit or even complete an audit? Isn't that true?
Not until this administration.
No, but in past years, isn't that true?
They have not done the audit as required by Congress.
That's right. And this year they did an audit, but they didn't pass the audit, right?
They completed the audit.
They completed the audit. They didn't pass the audit, right? They realized they had a lot of work to do to figure out where
they did realize they have a lot of work to do.
And that didn't stop you from putting more money into defense, did it?
It did not.
Right. So obviously we want to root out wasteful spending wherever it is, no matter what agency. But just because there's an increase in a budget doesn't mean that everything else in that budget is somehow wasteful. I also was interested in your response to Senator Stabenow. You said that the reasons for cuts to programs was they were, quote, not effective. Is that right?
With regard to which one?
Because they were not effective. I thought you said that in
I did
block,
say that.
right?
I was trying to remember what you were referencing.
Not effective. Is NIH investment, is that an effective investment for the taxpayer?
We do think that NIH is an effective investment. As a father of a child that has cystic fibrosis, many of the life-saving drugs that she benefits from have been developed based on research at NIH.
Right.
I will also tell you that the levels that we are providing NIH resources at are above the fiscal year 17 levels. And that
is true, Mr. Vought, and that was a decision made by Congress. We actually increased the Trump administration's proposal. You've cut it. I just hope you got to get your story straight with the agency heads, because I serve on the Appropriations Committee, and when we ask them about why programs were cut, they usually don't say it's because they were ineffective. They usually say that OMB told us we had to make trade-offs. That's the reason they give us. And I'm going to follow up on Senator Stabenow's question. All these programs that are cut because you say they're ineffective, I'd like the backup as well, where there's a finding of ineffectiveness. Now, I have a question on the Department of Transportation. I see that you cut the Department of Transportation budget by about $5 billion for 2020. That includes cuts to the capital investment, grants. Those are a primary source of federal assistance to transit programs, cutting other capital projects within the Department of Transportation. It's $5 billion this year. Since we don't have the tables yet for the out years, and since you're reducing the caps in the out years for non-defense domestic spending, can you tell us, is it going to be more than $5 billion a year cut for the Department of Transportation in those out years?
Again, I think it's important to provide context for the Department of Transportation's funding level. As you know, our first two budgets had very different levels in terms of what we proposed. We proposed, as a result of Congress saying we're going to spend more, we're going to have a higher non-defense cap level, we wanted a significant amount of that to go towards infrastructure to reflect our shared priorities on that front. We asked for a huge investment to be put forward as it pertains to infrastructure in the discretionary side.
Yeah.
That is why we don't go all the way. When we show a reduction, we're saying we're still above the fiscal year 17
but you're not, you're, okay. I appreciate the commentary, but you are cutting by $5 billion in the Department of Transportation. I asked you if that cut went right through the 10 years of your budget. I suspect it does. We don't have them yet. Usually when we have a budget hearing, we actually get the full budget. So that would be $50 billion minimum. And to pick up on what Senator Enzi pointed out, when you look at what you did with respect to the Highway Trust Fund, you essentially cut it by $146 billion. Now, you say you're just following current law, right?
Right.
Now, you didn't follow current law in your baseline when it comes to extending the tax cuts for wealthy people, did you?
No, we had a proposal.
No, you had a proposal there. You had a policy proposal there, and you could have done the same exact thing when it came to transportation funding. So the reality is, when you look at your policy proposals, you're cutting $146 billion under the Highway Trust Fund. You're cutting about $50 billion at least in the Department of Transportation. And then you come up and say you got a $200 billion infrastructure plan because the president says it's a priority. I net this out. It looks like you're underwater. It looks like it's net under 200. At best, you're even in terms of your infrastructure investments. When you add in the cuts to water infrastructure and your rural infrastructure programs, you're not even close. So how can you say this is a priority for the president, then come out with a budget that on net cuts infrastructure?
Senator, we think that we've put forward a budget that includes significant investments.
You put it in one pocket, and then with the other hand, you take it away. So it's a great shell game. But the reality is, on net, your budget is cutting infrastructure. Mr. Chairman, can I have one question on federal employees? All right, are we going to have a second round for those of us who are sticking around? I appreciate it. So on federal employees, quick question, because it's not clear here. Your budget, as I see it, projects a 2.3% increase in the CPI, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you include a cost of living pay increase for civilian federal employees?
We don't, but we have a proposal in the budget to ensure that performance is rewarded at federal agencies so that high performance can get raises, can be retained. We think it's an important aspect of this budget because when we look at the federal employee surveys that come in, and only about 25% of workers think that their pay is in any way based on performance. And then we also look at the fact that overall federal employees receive more compensation than their private sector counterparts.
As you know, Mr. Vought, that is true for some sectors of federal employees. That's not true for lower wage federal employees, is it? Do you know what the starting wage for a TSA employee is?
Off the top of my head, no.
It's $32,000. You think that does that sound way out of whack to you?
There is certainly a universe of individuals where are underpaid and those who are overpaid.
And I appreciate that, but for those that are underpaid, you're not giving them even a cost of living increase. In fact, you're cutting, this is my last question. You're effectively cutting their pay, and here's why. You have a proposal in here to increase the contribution that every federal employee has to give to their pension without increasing their pension by 1 penny. Isn't that true?
We do have a proposal to balance what the employee pays along with what the agency pays to be able to save money.
You're asking the employees, all of them put in more, right?
They will have to put in more.
And they're not getting a penny more in pension, right? Isn't that right?
Not necessarily, Senator, because they can be eligible for the retention.
For the money they put in, they're not getting any additional
money. True, but in terms of
so when you're taking money out of a current paycheck and not providing any increased retirement benefit, that's a pay cut, pure and simple.
If they're high performers, they can be eligible for bonuses and incentive payments.
But if you're a $32,000 a year starting TSA employee, you're getting a pay cut. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, you used up the second turn as well. Senator Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vought, when your budget or the president's budget proposes $1.5 trillion in cuts to Medicaid and $845 billion cuts to Medicare, when you propose that, you obviously studied how many people would die as a result of lack of access to health care. What conclusion did you reach? How many thousands of people do you think will die because of massive cuts to Medicare and Medicaid?
Senator, those numbers that you cited are not accurate. We do not cut Medicare by $850 billion. What that doesn't account for is the fact that we take things outside of Medicare, for such as uncompensated care, to non-Medicare beneficiaries. We move that outside of Medicare. We're going to still spend money on uncompensated care for non-Medicare beneficiaries, but when you adjust for the things where we put it back in other parts of the budget, there is no cut at all, because Medicare is going up each and every year, and also it's $517 in savings instead of the number that you cited. And there's a
well, it's going up every year in nominal dollars. I understand that, but you will concede that healthcare inflation is higher than general inflation. So if you're not even keeping up with healthcare inflation, it in fact is a real healthcare cut. I mentioned earlier the very alarming concern that hospitals have about the devastation these cuts will do for senior citizens. And when you cut $1.5 trillion, you're also not including in your calculations the fact that there are more people who will be in the Medicare program. I suspect Medicaid, despite the administration's effort, will continue to expand. But you did not answer my question. There are studies out there which suggest that many thousands of Americans die every single year because they don't get to a doctor when they should. Did you, in your calculations about massive cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, come up with any numbers as to how many Americans will die or maybe get sicker because they don't have the health care that they need?
We don't think any of those scenarios will result. In fact, we look at the current situation when we look at a tragic scenario where a young boy in 2007, 2008, DeMonte Driver, died because of the fact that he had a toothache because of the wait lines within Medicaid. And we say that's a fundamentally broken system. We want a different system. We want states to have more control over
with less money. You want to throw, look, this president tried to throw millions of people off of Medicaid. Giving a block grant to a state with less money means massive cuts in Medicaid. Let's be honest about what you're doing. Let me ask you this question. President Trump campaigned about not cutting Medicare, not cutting Medicaid, and he's making massive cuts to Medicare and Medicaid. What should the American people think about that?
This budget's title is Promises Kept, Taxpayers First, and for a specific reason. The president kept his promises to the American people in this budget. We do not cut Medicare, we do not cut Social Security, and we do not cut Medicaid.
All right, I would respectfully suggest that is a dishonest answer. I think that's absolutely inaccurate. It is unfactual. And you will have to explain to somebody, not to me, why the hospitals in this country are scared to death about the impact that your budget and President Trump's budget will have on them. Please tell me why it is a good idea to extend tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country who are already doing phenomenally well, and then cut back on the ability of kids to get a college education or senior citizens in this country to stay warm in the wintertime. What is your logic about that one?
We think it's important that families be able to keep more of what is their own money.
And what percentage,
difference
the tax breaks that you guys passed last year, 83% of those benefits went to the top 1%. In fact, millions of Americans pay more in taxes. So what you are doing here is giving tax breaks to the wealthiest people who are doing phenomenally well. Then you're cutting back on education, making it harder for kids to get a college education. You're cutting back on nutrition programs. Do you really not have a conscience? Do you know that people all over this country, children, seniors—
We're not cutting back on nutrition programs.
Oh, you're not cutting back on the SNAP program?
We have reforms in the SNAP.
Oh, reforms.
Work requirement of a harvest box. We're not—
How much are you cutting back on these programs?
We have about $200 billion in savings from those.
Oh, savings, I see. See, to listen to these hearings, fellow Americans, you need to get a dictionary. Savings means cuts. Reform means massive cuts. Let's be clear what this budget is. This is a budget that benefits wealthy campaign contributors. This is a budget that goes to war against the working families of this country. This really is, in fact, a disgraceful budget, and I'm happy to say that there are going to be very few people, even Republicans, who will vote for this terrible budget. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I want to thank the witness for being here to testify. Again, I would mention that you have to go through this even though we just consider a president's budget to be suggestions. We hold the purse strings. We have to make the decisions. And your input has been helpful, and I thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There's an opportunity for those senators that were at other places to submit questions that I hope you will answer promptly. They have to have them in by tomorrow night at 5 p.m. And so any additional questions can be submitted. Thank you. Adjourn.
It doesn't seem we're winning a lot in the military. I think we should. I mean, obviously. Yeah, well, they like to talk about lobsters. I like to talk about bombs, you know, and why are we spending so much money on, you know, preparing for war, involved in war, involved in nations that have only destroyed people's lives, and yet they want to reward the military. Yeah, I guess they're anxious to go work for Raytheon or Boeing or Northrop Grumman after they leave in this revolving door that is this wonderful place called Congress. It's sad, isn't it? How do you like the hearing? Yeah, the Democrats were actually pretty good. I thought he was better than usual. Democrats were pretty good, except so much of this budget is limited. Right. So you would think a disproportionate amount of time would be spent on the military.
Or somebody would at least get the same question besides lobster tails.
Yeah. They want to go on the safe things, which is education and Medicare, which are all important. Yeah. But if you look at where the real pot of money is, well, that education, how you can get this tax write-off if you're giving to vouchers.
Give it to your Jesuit high school. Give it to your Mercy High School.